In January 1939, Rear Admiral Thomas O. Malloy, United States Coast Guard, gave a speech in New York City in which he stated that in the last year, the Coast Guard had received 14,000 calls for assistance and had performed 8,600 in-peril rescues, a record number. According to Malloy, emphasis needed to be placed on educating boaters on basic seamanship and knowledge of federal laws. There were more than 300,000 recreational boats operating in federal waters, and the Coast Guard needed help to keep up with search and rescue demands. During this time, civilians such as Malcolm Stewart Boylan, Commodore of the Pacific Writers Yacht Club in Los Angeles, were pushing Washington to organize yachtsmen to assist the Coast Guard as volunteers. As Germany and Japan occupied neighboring countries, Rear Admiral Russell R. Weische and other Coast Guard officers also recognized that additional sources of manpower would be needed in case of America's entry into a European or Pacific war. In response to these pressures, legislation was submitted to Congress, and on June 23, 1939, a bill establishing a civilian volunteer Coast Guard reserve was signed into law. Its stated purpose was to promote recreational boating safety and to facilitate the operations of the Coast Guard. Boat owners would be organized into flotillas and then into divisions within Coast Guard districts. The organization would be administered by the Coast Guard. In September 1939, World War II began in Europe when the German military invaded Poland. By 1941, almost 200 flotillas had formed around the country. The reservists trained their members in seamanship, first aid, gunnery, and signaling. In February of that year, when U.S. involvement in the European war threatened, legislation was passed that changed the name of the reserve to the auxiliary and established a regular military reserve in which men would be subject to military law and the Articles of War. The pre-war buildup of Coast Guard personnel had begun. With Coast Guard officers in command, the auxiliarists patrolled regattas, guarded harbors, enforced the 1940 Motorboat Act and the Espionage Act, and delivered supplies to lighthouses. By the late spring of 1941, the Coast Guard was on a near-war footing. Battle of the Atlantic had been raging for 2 years, and American citizens had become victims of German attacks. Following the torpedoing of the U.S. merchant ship Robin Moore, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared an unlimited national emergency on May 27, 1941. To meet the need for more warships, the first civilian boats were enrolled by the auxiliary in June. By November, 275 40 to 90-foot reserve vessels and most of their crews had entered Coast Guard service. Then, on December 7, 1941, following the Japanese attack on the United States forces at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, many auxiliary units began 24-hour security patrols. On December 12th, one day after he declared war on America, Chancellor Adolf Hitler met with Erich Raeder, head of the German Navy. They decided to send submarines to raid commercial vessels off the U.S. coast. The first 6 U-boats arrived in January 1942. By the middle of May, an estimated 180 vessels had been sunk along the East Coast, some in sight of onlookers on shore. Official records state, time after time, auxiliarists took their tiny boats out, a few armed with rifles, to haul drowning, burned merchant seamen from the sea. To meet the threat, in June of 1942, new legislation was passed. It allowed auxiliarists to enter the Coast Guard Reserve on a part-time basis, and thousands transferred themselves and their boats. Throughout the war, the auxiliary formed the core of the temporary reserve membership and trained most of its personnel. In July, the Coastal Picket Force was formed. They consisted of 50 to 100-foot sailboats and motor cruisers that became the eyes and ears of the Navy. Auxiliary units were largely responsible for enrolling the vessels and crews. They also manned them as reservists along with newly recruited civilian yachtsmen. These lightly armed ships patrolled sectors along the 50-fathom curve of the Atlantic coast and were to detect, report, and attack German submarines if armament permitted. As a district commander ordered, if you have depth charges, use them. During the war, temporary reservists also patrolled the beaches and stood lookout on the coasts. Thousands guarded docks and ammunition ships. The reservists' most important function, however, was their inshore work. 50,000 men and a few women patrolled harbors, rivers, bridges, and factories. They guided naval vessels and landing craft to ports and conducted search and rescue. They boarded vessels to check identification papers and to seal radios on all merchant ships in U.S. ports. They cleared debris and provided emergency assistance when drownings, floods, on-the-water plane crashes, and boat fires and explosions occurred. In 1943, Fuller Dunton and Cliff Huskins of Flotilla 208 in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, became temporary reservists and conducted night patrols.
About 5 o'clock, and we patrol all night until 6 the next morning, and then we go ashore and go to work for the day.
By mid-1943, when the German submarine threat had decreased and the need for personnel overseas increased, most water patrols ended. The temporary reservists were pulled in to perform training and other shore duties for the duration of the war. Following the war, as millions of Americans returned to civilian life, the auxiliary expanded its membership and activities through new legislation and programs. Under a 1944 law, aircraft and marine radios had been added as operational facilities. A March 1946 conference of district directors and commodores held in Washington decided that membership would be restricted to facility owners and urged intensification of activities. In 1947, the Courtesy Marine Examination Program was implemented on a national basis. Under it, qualified auxiliarists examined recreational boats for required equipment and systems. Then, in January 1948, the auxiliary launched its public education program at the National Boat Show in New York City. Visitors were given free lectures on topics ranging from piloting to weather. So, by 1949, the 13,000 auxiliary members nationwide had established the three traditional cornerstone programs: operations, public education, and vessel examination. The fourth traditional cornerstone, fellowship, had always characterized auxiliary friendships and social activities. The post-war era was a period of unparalleled economic prosperity in America. Millions of newly affluent families bought houses in the suburbs. They purchased cars and boats. A Westchester County, New York flotilla advertised a safe boating course at its local movie theater. 350 people came to register at the first class, and the police were called to control the crowd. By 1959, there were 40 million boating enthusiasts in the country. The auxiliary expanded as the number of boaters increased, opening new flotillas across the United States and in the Caribbean, and reactivating operations in Alaska. The National Board was incorporated, and Bert C. Pouncey, Jr. was elected the first National Commodore in 1951. By 1961, auxiliarists were educating almost 100,000 people yearly on the regulations of the 1958 Federal Boating Act. They also trained state law enforcement officials in seamanship and the new law. They were examining 50,000 vessels a year for required equipment. Even Elvis Presley received a safety decal for his boat. Individual auxiliary members also received recognition for their work. In 1953, Miguel Colorado of Puerto Rico was awarded the Plaque of Merit, the highest life-saving award given in the auxiliary, for saving 2 survivors of a capsized boat off Caballo Blanco reefs. He also organized flotillas in Puerto Rico and spearheaded safe boating campaigns. He was elected Commodore of the 7th District in 1963. Today, Colorado is still a member at age 98. Ed Cook of Pompano Beach, Florida, became known as a one-man Coast Guard. In 1967 alone, he executed more than 100 search and rescue cases. In 1957, the auxiliary as a whole was awarded the Evinrude Award for outstanding contributions to recreational boating afloat. In 1968, it received a citation for distinguished service to safety from the National Safety Council. Under the leadership of Steve Sadowski of Massachusetts, the auxiliary launched Safe Boating Week in 1952 in the 1st District. National Safe Boating Week was proclaimed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on June 4, 1958. Today, it remains a hallmark of auxiliary activity. By 1965, the federal government had transformed boating in the United States. The Army Corps of Engineers had built 190 inland lakes and reservoirs that added 25,000 miles of shoreline to waterways. Landlubbers in the Plain States and the West were flocking to man-made lakes. This added growth in boating convinced federal administrators to allow Coast Guard auxiliary units to operate on sole state waters for the first time under the provisions of the 1971 Federal Boating Act. As a result, during the 1970s, the search and rescue caseload soared, reaching a peak of 58,000 persons assisted in 1980. In 1973, women were integrated into the regular Coast Guard service, ending their reserve status. In 1977, they were assigned shipboard duties. The rise of the feminist movement and the larger numbers of Coast Guard servicewomen encouraged more women to join the auxiliary, although a number had been members since the earliest years. Betty McNabb, the famous pilot, joined the original reserve in 1940. In the past, there also were about 12 flotillas composed of women only. The auxiliary provided the Coast Guard with its first women vessel operators and pilots. In 1979, Bowling Douglas of the 7th District, a Marine surveyor by trade, became the first female district commodore. In 1973, Lillian Phillips and Mary Roeder of Flotilla 12-5 in Tacoma, Washington, were awarded the Certificate of Administrative Merit by the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral James S. Gracie, for developing the Water and Kids Boating Safety Course. With this course and future ones, youth enrollments became the largest component of the public education program, averaging 225,000 students per year in the early 1990s. During the mid-1980s, the country experienced an economic boom that led to an increase in the number of millionaires and young entrepreneurs. Perhaps as a reflection of this prosperity, the number of auxiliary pilots grew by 100% to more than 400.
A primary job is pilot, and I fly search and rescue missions, and I also train observers for the Coast Guard Auxiliary.
The auxiliary also provided boating safety services at large public events held during the decade. At the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, 11th District members crewed 100 vessels that performed port security, operational support, sailing qualification trials, and picket patrol duties, logging more than 21,000 man-hours. On average, 100 auxiliarists were on duty each day during the Olympics. The July 4, 1986 Operation Sail event in New York City celebrated the 100th birthday of the Statue of Liberty. Auxiliarists assisted the Coast Guard during the parade of tall ships and were on duty at the spectacular nighttime fireworks. Since the early 1970s, auxiliary members have conducted picket and safety patrols during space launches from Cape Canaveral. Following the 1986 Challenger shuttle explosion, auxiliary crews participated in the search and recovery operation. During the 1980s, the auxiliary also became more professional. The Boat Crew Program was instituted in 1984. Under the watchful eyes of specially qualified examiners, auxiliarists must meet specific training requirements. Through the Boat Crew Program, auxiliarists meet qualification standards similar to those required of Coast Guardsmen. During this time, the Coast Guard Academy Recruitment Program, known as AIM, was solidly established. A division chief was appointed at the national level. New district staff officers were trained by the Coast Guard. Through AIM, high school juniors spend a week at the academy and experience a taste of swab summer. A new management and awards program known as the Auxiliary Mission Objective System was established in 1987. In September of 1990, Robert and Jean Colby of Michigan played a vital role in one of the most dramatic events in auxiliary case history. They rescued 5 crewmen who had entered the waters of the Saginaw River to escape the explosions, flames, and smoke of a 1-million-gallon gasoline tanker that had caught fire. For their extreme and heroic daring and assistance provided for days afterwards, the Colbys received the Gold Life-Saving Medal, the Plaque of Merit, and the Coast Guard Auxiliary Group Action Award. As the auxiliary entered its 6th decade, the Coast Guard began to integrate auxiliarists into the everyday functioning of the service. Legislation passed in 1996 expanded auxiliary purposes to include its assistance in any Coast Guard mission, except direct law enforcement and military operations, as authorized by the Commandant. As a result, today, auxiliarists examine commercial fishing vessels. They report repairs needed on aids to navigation and help the Coast Guard maintain them. They monitor the operation and offloading of barges in harbors. They help Coast Guard crews lay containment booms during oil spills. Many small boat search and rescue stations are staffed, in part or full, by auxiliarists. Since the first jet ski was built in 1973, the auxiliary has been observing the phenomenal growth of the industry. By 1995, more than 760,000 personal watercraft, or PWCs, were operating in U.S. waters. Realizing their potential as special patrol facilities, the auxiliary first used PWCs for operations in 1993. By 1998, there were a few dozen nationwide conducting various missions. The same year, the National Commodore requested auxiliary vessel examiners to increase the number of PWC examinations. Personal watercraft education efforts also have been stepped up. The decade of the 1990s ushered in some of the worst disasters in American history. Following Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 1992, in which 150-mile-per-hour winds devastated whole neighborhoods, auxiliarists cleared roads of debris, manned safety and aids to navigation patrols, provided food service, and flew as observers in Coast Guard's C-130 aircraft. During the 1993 Great Midwest floods, more than 200 auxiliarists ferried stranded homeowners, provided logistical support, flew levee patrols, maintained radio communications, and enforced closures on the Mississippi and other rivers. With the Cuban-Haitian boat lift in 1994, Coast Guardsmen were called to the Caribbean to rescue more than 56,000 immigrants fleeing their homelands. Auxiliary crews and vessels filled in for them at small boat stations in Florida and ensured that the search and rescue capability was being maintained. On July 17, 1996, Transworld Airlines Flight 800 en route to Paris exploded off Long Island, New York, killing more than 200 passengers and all the crew. The case, involving 1,000 Coast Guardsmen and 200 auxiliarists, constituted one of the largest search and recovery efforts in Coast Guard history. On the night of the 17th, Coxswain Arnold Michaels made his way to the Coast Guard station at Center Moriches. He and other crew were taken out to sea to board the Coast Guard cutter Adak. For the next 10 hours, the 76-year-old World War II combat veteran helped bring the bodies of victims on board. 21 awards of operational merit and awards of merit were presented to members of the 1st District Southern Region for their participation in this operation. On April 6, 1997, auxiliarist Frank Morrow of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, saved 4 persons from drowning while on duty as a crew member of a Coast Guard vessel. He pulled 1 child and 3 adults out of a strong current that had forced their boat under the forward rake of a moored barge. For his actions that day, Morrow received the Coast Guard Gold Life-Saving Medal. Also in April of 1997, devastating 15-foot floodwaters of the Red River engulfed Grand Forks, North Dakota, and the surrounding region. tens of thousands of people were forced out of their homes. Grand Forks became a small ring of hell as 17 downtown buildings burned amid the water. The Coast Guard set up a 1,200-mile relief pipeline from St. Louis. Crews entered cold, wind and water-swept areas where there were no Coast Guard radio stations or bases and little food, power, and water. Thus, the regional auxiliaries provided vital links and logistics. The Coast Guard commander described the response. We had no VHF communications until the auxiliary provided it. We had no means of getting the on-scene commander on scene until the auxiliary provided it. At Wapiton, North Dakota, for the first time, the Coast Guard turned over 2 small boats to the auxiliary to maintain its own disaster response unit. 9 other relief units were deployed in towns along the Red River. Members ferried utility crews and homeowners. They marked obstructions in flooded roads and conducted rescues. A mobile command center was driven from Sioux City, Iowa. It afforded Coast Guard and auxiliary crews communications, shelter, and a work and rest area. When the waters neared Pembina, close to the Canadian border, the team set up operations at the base of a radio tower at a natural gas pipeline pumping station near Humboldt, Minnesota, and established communications between Pembina and Grand Forks, North Dakota. 4 auxiliary planes conducted levee surveys and rotated personnel in and out of the region. This allowed Coast Guard air crews to concentrate on search and rescue missions. 60 auxiliarists from 9 states, constituting 30% of Coast Guard Force's St. Louis Command, participated in the Red River relief efforts. In 40 days, 200 Coast Guard active duty, reserve, and auxiliary personnel conducted more than 900 boat and helicopter missions and rescued 916 people. 98 personal and unit awards, including 2 awards of operational merit and 22 awards of merit, were given to members at a ceremony held in Grand Forks in August 1997. The history you have just seen doesn't come close to telling all there is to tell of the tremendous service the volunteer members of the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary have contributed during the past 60 years. Although no reliable statistics exist, we do know that hundreds of thousands of people have taught safety and seamanship to literally millions of boaters and would-be boaters. Members have certified the proper operation of safety equipment on millions of recreational vessels and have saved thousands of lives. The largest volunteer marine safety organization in the world has created a proud tradition and carried out a worthy mission.